Welcome to our next series. We're going to do a multi-part video series on the basics of segmented turning, ring segmented turning. So you got to stay tuned for all the various sections, and there is a lot of good reference material that goes with this, and we will put a link in the bottom to my website again, which contains a number of articles, videos, and so on. This video today is about the basics. There's a little bit of calculations we have to do. There's a drawing we have to create. And so today we're going to create the drawing, a plan. We're going to go to the table saw and cut the segments. And in the next video, we'll put the rings together and assemble the vessel and turn it. And then we'll go on and advance it a little bit more. This will be a simple bowl to start with. The third one is going to be doing a hollow vessel. In other words, it's going to be a larger piece, and we're going to use a little bit more advanced techniques. And as we go through each video, I'll introduce a few comments and accessories and things about the things and techniques and tools and accessories and all the stuff that you may need to do this. Go through the first one. At the end of this video, we're going to actually post the cut list that I'm going to make up. In a few minutes, I'm going to draw it, and you'll be able to reproduce that and actually make this simple bowl yourself if you choose to do that. So let's get started. But before we do and go to the saw, it's really important that we understand all the terms that relates to how to make these different pieces. So I prepared a short little lecture video, which we'll go to now, and it kind of give you those basics. See you in a couple minutes after the video. So let's make our project. We're going to start off with a simple bowl. Let's write down the specs here for what we're going to do. It's going to be a small one, so we'll make a diameter of 6 inches. And I don't want it too tall, so I'll make the height or the thickness of the bowl. Let's just make it about 2.5 inches. The segmented rings, we're going to make 12 segments each. So the number of segments per ring is 12. And the last thing I'm going to have to specify before we start is the thickness of each of the layers. And that's a function of the wood. I happen to have some wood that is 5/8 inch thick. So let's make it 5/8. Okay, make our drawing. I'm going to draw a line which will be a center line for the bowl. I'm only going to draw half of a bowl. That's all I really need. So this is the foot. It's going to be a 1/2 inch thick. And I'm going to just pen in a rough shape, best I can do. A nice curve. That's the outside. I can't stop there. I've got to have a wall. So I'm going to make a 1/4 inch wall. That's 2 squares on the graph paper coming around. I'm trying to make it as parallel as I can. I can correct that in the actual turning when I get there. Okay. There's the pieces we need, and we're going to break it into 4 layers, each 5/8 of an inch thick. So let's just draw lines in that will indicate where those layers will start and stop. And having gridded graph paper helps me in this. It's 1, 2, 3, and our 4th layer. Now that I have those in, I can show how wide each piece of wood needs to be. For instance, the base piece has to be that wide. The second level has to be wide enough to include the whole curvature. And as the curvature comes more vertical, you can see the width of the pieces becomes narrower. So there's the thickness of the bottom. It's going to be a 1 square piece of wood. And number 2, number 3, and obviously number 4. So I need to know the radius of each of those, and I might as well write it down so I can use that in my calculations. The first 2 come all the way out to the dimension. The second one, the radius is a little narrower. And the bottom is going to be about 2 3/8, I think. Yeah. Okay. With this information, 3, yeah. Okay, got it. So now what we can need to do is to build a table including all the information that we need to get this project done. First of all, we need to know the diameter because we need to calculate circumference and then segment edge length from that. So the diameter is easy. That's just twice the radius. So it's 6 inches, 6 inches, 5.5, 4.5. Yep, 4.5. Okay. Now the next thing we need is the circumference of the piece, and that is pi 3.14 times that diameter. So 3.14 times 6 is 18.84 for those first two, and it turns out to be 17.25 there, and the bottom is just still a square, so I don't need any circumference. Now that I have the circumference, I can calculate the segment edge length of one of the first dimensions that we need for the project. And that's easy because I'm going to take each of these and divide it by 12. So 18.84 divide by 12 is going to be 1.57. And the next piece is going to be the same segment edge line. In other words, the same diameter of ring is going to be. The last one is 1.44, still a square. So the last thing we now need to know is how wide of a piece of wood do we rip in order to create those segments suitable to include the whole curvature of each layers. So actually in this case, I can go to looking at the graph and count the number of squares. Since they're 1/8 of an inch squares, that's 3/8. That one's going to be, let's go a little bit bigger than, looks like 1/2 an inch, but let's go 5/8. And counting the squares there. Another way you can do this is just 1 inch here. That's easy. I could take the outside radius dimension, subtract the inside radius dimension, and I'd have the same number. So we have everything but one thing. Most important to save your fingertips is the minimum length of stock that we're going to work with. So that is that circumference plus 1.5 inches for saw kerf, so we cut out, plus 3 more inches just for finger protection. So this is absolute minimum, and it's a rough thing, but if it's longer than 24 or 25, that's just great. And a 4.5 inch square is still a 4.5 inch square. So we're going to cut it into 12 segments for each layer. And if I have a miter gauge, I'm going to need one measurement, but for my Seg Easy sled, I just need to know that the included angle is 30 degrees. But if you're cutting with a miter sled, where you take half off of each side, you're going to have half of that dimension, or 15 degrees. Got everything we need? Let's go to work. So let's pack up here, go over to the table saw, and let's talk about how to cut 12 segments so that they will fit together accurately and tightly for each of these rings. Okay, we're at the table saw. I have my cut list. I have off camera ripped my 3 segment strips to width already. Before we get started on cutting those, let me talk to you about how I'm going to cut them. And there have been a lot of techniques where we have various kinds of miter sleds that you can set to the cutting angle of 15 degrees. But they require calibration, which means that every time that you cut a different number of segments, what you'll have to do is cut a few test rings, put them together, check for gaps, readjust the angle. Well, a couple years ago, a man named Jerry Bennett came up with a new technique, which he called the wedgie sled. And let me show you how that is, because it takes all of those errors of table saw setup, accurate measurements, and so on, all out of the formula. This is a wedgie sled. Set these aside. It has 2 fences. Both are adjustable. And I'm going to cut one side here, and then I'm going to move the piece without flipping to the other fence and cut the second side there. And what this process does is take out all of those errors associated with blade alignment, arbor adjustment, all those little things that would contribute to an inaccurate angle. So when Jerry did that, he came up with a group of wedgies that put between these fence will allow us to set that angle. Well, you don't need these for a 12-segment ring. You can go down to the office supply store and pick up a 30, 60, 90 triangle. And if I put that between these two fences and lock them down, I can get a perfect 30 degrees. So let me lock one fence in place, push my square in here, and it's binding all the way up and down, which is exactly what I want. There is my 30-degree angle. And when I cut these strips, set that aside, I'm going to cut the first piece here, then I'm going to pick it up and move it over here and cut the other side there. And what this will do is give me a perfect 12-segment ring. Now there's one other thing I'm going to do to the wood before I cut it. I'm going to take my pencil, I'm going to put a line right down the top edge, and I'm going to put a line right down one face. And what that is to do is to remind me to always keep this line up and keep this line facing forward. So as I cut this piece, I'm going to cut here, simply set it over here and cut it again, and that first segment of 12 for a 12-segment ring will have been cut. Now the last thing I need to do is to set up how long is this going to have to be. Well, I have a stop here that I have built, and it allows me to be able to measure the distance between the blade and this stop. So the first piece we measured was going to be 1.25 inches, and I measured here between the right setting tooth and that end, and I know that's exactly 1.25 inches. So I'm going to bring this down here out of the way and lock this fence down. And I'm going to proceed to cut. Now, the worst thing you could ever have is to get down there and have just this little tiny piece left and you have one more cut to make. Don't do that. I came up with a segment, stick length that was minimal for safety. Safety meaning that when we get done with that last piece, there ought to be enough here that I can hold it tightly to the fence and not have my fingers any place near that saw blade. Longer is fine. Much longer is fine. It also gives you extra wood in case you have to recut something. So that would be nice. So I'm not going to set the saw blade height. And that's ready to cut. One last thing. Nice help. I've made a zero clearance insert piece for the table saw. And on the right hand side of it, I've glued a piece of quarter round. I hung it over the blade slightly, raised the blade up through it. So now when I cut the segment, it'll hit this and fall away from the blade. Chances of it getting caught and flipped back is low. Not 100%, but it's pretty darn low. So let's cut number 2. As you see, I've labeled them 2. The first one is number 1, which is the square base. I've already got it squared off. 2, 3, and 4. They've been ripped to width. All I have to do is cut them to length. So let's do the first one. Safety glasses on. Saw is going to move cleanly and easily. Now the first cut is simply to square it off. And so we'll cut 12 seconds. Okay, finished cutting all 12 segments. And I'm going to simply keep them here on the table saw for a minute. That's the trim piece we don't need. Now when I assemble this ring, let's put the blade down just for safety. When I assemble this ring, I'm going to have all the pencil marks up, and I'm going to have the outside pencil mark and the inside pencil mark alternating. In, out, in. 2 more ins here. Out, in, out, in, out, in. So that's going to be the 12 pieces, but I have a sanding step I've got to do because each of these pieces have burrs on it. And that comes off the blade. And if I try to glue this together now, these will interfere with this forming a perfect ring. So what I'm going to do is sand each of these edges, and I'm going to then put them in a bag and call that the first one ready to go up, which will be in the next video. And then we'll cut the second ring and the third ring the same way. Okay, I'm taking each of the pieces here, piece of 180 grit sandpaper, and just knocking all the burrs off. Those things that would interfere with it, there's a great one right there. Those pieces folded over when I put the ring together will cause the edges not to fit snugly. So it's just a quick sanding. Generally I'd cut all the pieces for all the rings and then sand them. And I'm just using a piece of 180 grit. These corners, if I round them off a little bit, it's not a problem. Those corners will be turned away when we glue up the ring and build it into the vessel. So I'm just about done. I mean, this is how fast it goes, but you got to do it. This is soft maple I'm using here, so it's not a junk wood, and even at that, it has created a lot, oh my, a lot of burrs. And so I do all edges, inside and out. Last piece. Oh, that's the master with all the burrs. That's got more than the other piece had. So clean all those edges. Has to be done in order to get a nice tight joint. Okay, let's assemble the ring right here on the camera. And I want a mark on the outside, a mark on the inside. Line's always on the top. Outside, in, out, in. And by alternating these, any error in the setup will have been canceled out. In, out, in, out, in. So there's my 12 pieces for my first ring. Just so we can see where we're going, let me put a clamp around it and just show you what this ring's going to look like. The next video, we're going to spend a lot of time gluing these things up. I'm pushing them out so they all sit nice and snugly where they're supposed to. And there's our first ring. All done. So what we're now going to do, actually it's not. I have 2 pieces that are upside down. See that? And see that? So I have actually not followed my marks. So what I'm going to do is take those 2 pieces and reverse them so that all the pencil marks are on the top as I want. And so there is our first ring. We'll talk about clamping and gluing and assembling the vessel in our next video. And there's the ring. And I have a number on one of these pieces, so I know that is ring number 2. And we're not perfectly flat, and that's okay. We'll take care of all those things as we build the vessel. So, make the drawing, calculate out the dimensions you need, build a segmented sled like this for the most accuracy. And in the references, we'll show you the website for Seg Easy, where you can go find plans for how to build it and information on how it works in more detail than here. So we'll see you in part 2, where we build the rings and assemble the bowl. See you in the next part.